Senator Tom Harkin. Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. A project of Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, with Access Video, University of San Francisco.
Okay, so when did you first recognize the link between disability and civil rights?
Disability and civil rights. Let me think about that a second.
I didn't say I'd start with an easy one.
Well, let me lead into it this way. I first recognized the need to make changes in laws and things to address aspects of disability when I was in the House of Representatives. See, I grew up with my brother who's deaf, and when I got in the House, I formed a working relationship with then Senator Jennings Randolph from West Virginia. And that was just about the time, and I was also on the Science and Technology Committee in the House. And they were just developing the encoding for television, for closed captioning. And just about the time I got here, I found out that they were working on providing that line at the bottom of the television screens for that. And they were making a decoding implement to go on a television set. And so I worked with Jennings Randolph at that time to get Sears Roebuck to make this instrument, decoding device, a great big box, and to sell it for cost. If I remember, it was $179, if I remember. And we delivered the first one to then President Jimmy Carter in the White House, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 1978, I believe. And I think my brother got the fifth one ever made. And I began to see, just what laws could do, to start changing the impact on people with disabilities and how they live. Of course, during my time in the House, I was also involved on debates on Public Law 94-142, Education of All Handicapped Children's Act. And also what would later become called the Rehab Act. Even though I wasn't on the Education Committee, I was greatly concerned about those. Then there was a couple of years here where I didn't do anything. I got to the Senate, and immediately getting to the Senate, discovered after I'd been here about a year that there was a move afoot to enact the sweeping comprehensive disability law. And at about that time in 1987, in January of 1987, I believe it was, I was asked by Senator Kennedy, because the Democrats had taken the Senate back then, and because there were openings on committee, I was asked by Senator Kennedy to go on his committee. And I said I was already scheduled to go on another committee. And I told him that I would if I could get the chairmanship of the Disability Policy Subcommittee. And he said, sure. And so that's how that happened. And then I became actively involved in it. And I guess that's when I first really began to see that civil rights legislation should be more, that disability rights legislation ought to be more than piecemeal. I'd always thought of it before as well. You do this for the deaf, you do this for the blind, you do this for people with other physical disabilities, you do this for people with mental disabilities. I had not thought about an overarching, comprehensive civil rights bill until that time. And that's when I first started getting involved in it.
And what was there going on in the country at that time that that sort of made all that bubble to the surface? I mean, some people say it could be passed then, but it would have a hard time passing today. What were the strands that were going on that said that the times were right for passing a law like that?
Well, I think you had a number of individuals who were interested, and they were in key positions. And I don't know. I've been here long enough to see that it's hard to describe how the times and the people and the circumstances all come together sometimes to move a piece of legislation. Sometimes it just happens. And fortunately, we had people like Tony Coelho in the House, Steny Hoyer. We had people in the White House that were very concerned about this. President Bush lent his support to it. Boyden Gray, who was very strong for this. And then in the Senate, we had Lowell Weicker, who was a great champion. I mean, he was sort of the first one that kind of got me going on it in the beginning. Of course, Ted Kennedy. And then you just had the disability movement just sort of all kind of came together. Before, they always had been separate little pieces out there, and all of a sudden, they had locked arms, and they were just kind of all together. So the first bill that was introduced was really very comprehensive, and people recognized right away that there was no way that that was ever going to pass. And so then, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that was introduced by Lowell Weicker, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's true. Is that true? That's true. And then Lowell Weicker left the Senate. And as I said, I became chairman of that subcommittee on disability policy. And then we went through, we being the disability community and others, went through the whole process of rewriting it and drafting it. And fortunately, I had a good guy on my staff, Bobby Silverstein. I think of people like Pat Wright and others that just, that just recognized that we had to redraft this and get it in a form that could pass, which we did.
And talk to me about the major obstacles, the turning points from your point of view in the process of getting it passed. Where were the times that you thought, oh, it's never going to pass, or were there moments?
Well, there were a lot of things along the way. I remember when ADAP either chained themselves together. They came up the House steps. I remember that, blocked up the House steps, and that made a lot of commotion, a lot of noise, and kind of got everyone's attention to ask the questions, what's this all about? I remember dealings with the White House, and probably one of the biggest stumbling blocks to our getting ADA through was a guy by the name of John Sununu. And I remember one time I was down in the White House on a social occasion, visiting with President Bush. And I just happened to get on the elevator with him. And I said to him, you're backing the Americans with Disabilities Act, the bill that we have in the Senate. I said, we're having some real problems. And quite frankly, your Chief of Staff, Mr. Sununu, is not being very helpful on this, and we need some help on it. He immediately got Boyden Gray, and Boyden Gray, whether he was tasked before that or after, I don't know, but about that time, Boyden Gray came in and weighed in very heavily on it, and was sort of his representative then after that, and was very, very supportive. That was kind of a turning point there, because we had someone else to deal with other than Mr. Sununu.
So if you hadn't had that chance in the elevator, it might have been a different story?
Yeah, just a chance. I just happened to be in the elevator with the president, and I just told him outright that we were having trouble with Mr. Sununu, and he was blocking up. I didn't think that Mr. Sununu was reflecting what he wanted. I think another big turning point was when Bob Dole called all of us together in a classic historical meeting in the Capitol. It was in a room upstairs in the Capitol. I wish I could remember what room it was right now. But all the players were there. Skinner, Mr. Skinner, who was Secretary of Transportation. I'm sorry, the Attorney General Thornburg was there. Dick Thornburg was there, who was also very helpful on this, by the way. Boyden Gray was there. Mr. Sununu was there. There may have been someone else there from the administration I'm missing right now, but I know they were there. And Senator Dole, Senator Kennedy, I was there, Bobby Silverstein, my staff person. And a couple of House members were there at the time. Steny Hoyer. Tony Quayle had already left the House. Major Owens. We're sitting at this table, and Sununu was on one side, and I'm sitting on the other side, just about across from Sununu. Bobby Silverstein is sitting next to me, and Kennedy is sitting next to Bobby Silverstein. And we're going through the bill. Now, this is at the point where the House has passed it and the Senate's passed it, but we got two different versions. We're trying to work out the differences. And Sununu is there raising all of these points about the bill and why it can't work in the fashion that we had it in the Senate. And so he'd raise this point, and every time he'd raise a point, I remember there was something about a barber shop of somebody in New Hampshire, some barber on the second floor or something like that. Every time he would raise a point, Bobby Silverstein, who was my staff, would say, Mr. Sununu, no, section so-and-so of the bill says this. That's not right what you did here, and he would cite it for him and read him the exact language. Well, this happened like 3 times. When Sununu would say something, well, this bill's bad because it'll do this, it'll put this business out, and it'll do this. And every time Bobby Silverstein would correct him, say, well, no, here's what the bill says. Finally, after about the 3rd time, Sununu blew his stack. He looked at Bobby Silverstein, he said, and he just started yelling at him. I mean, he just yelled at him. Said, I don't need any more of this from you. Every time I say something, you always bring something up. He said, I don't want to hear any more from you. And he just started yelling at Bobby Silverstein. Well, I'm thinking in my head, I can't get by with that. I'm trying to think what my response is going to be to this unseemly outbreak by Sununu. It was just unseemly. And just about the time I was thinking about it, and Sununu was about halfway through his tirade, Dr. Kennedy jumped up, and he leaned across the table, and I thought he was going to grab Sununu by the collar. And he took his hand and he hit it on the table, boom, right in front of Sununu's face. And he pointed his finger at him and he said, if you want to yell at anybody, you yell at me. Or you yell at Senator Harkin. You don't yell at staff. That's our staff. You don't yell at staff. You want something to say, you say it to me. Now you want to yell at me? He said, you go right ahead and you start yelling at me. And Sununu just got about lower and lower in his chair. And I think that was a great turning point, because it was just sort of one of those things. And then because the other Bush administration people were there, who were basically, I don't think, in line with Sununu, but no one was willing to dress Sununu down, and Senator Kennedy dressed him down, and that was it. Sununu never raised any more points after that. That was just the end of Sununu's objections. I've always thought that was one big turning point. In the thing. It was a very dramatic occurrence. I think the other turning points is when we finally got over the hurdle on the Chapman Amendment on food service handlings. There was a lot of things raised on the bill, and at that time, if you remember, that's when the AIDS scare was just about at its peak. And people thought, well, people were going to spit in your food and you were going to get AIDS and all that kind of stuff. And food handlers would have AIDS and you'd get it. And so there's all this big fear about that raised. And we were able to handle that, and we got it done in a good manner, and we got over it. But it was a very tenuous point right there for a while, and we worked that out.
How does this work, and how does this rank in your life's work?
Well, I've said the passage of it is the highlight of my legislative career. It was a long process. It was emotionally draining. You think it's going to get through, you think it's going to happen, and it drags on and on and on, and then the AIDS scare came up. And I don't know, I know there were times I had my own doubts that this could ever get through, or if it got through, it'd be so weak and so watered down it would be meaningless. And the Disability Committee would have a cruel joke played on them. That was my biggest fear, is that we would pass something that wouldn't do anything. And then people say, oh, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this great? And it wouldn't get anything done.
What was,
But to me, it represents one of the 2 or 3 major things I've ever done in my entire lifetime.
what was your proudest moment?
Well, my proudest moment was obviously when the Senate passed the bill, because I was in charge of it, and it was my committee, and we had it on the floor, and the Senate passed it. It was a great moment to have it on the Senate floor and to have it passed by such an overwhelming margin on the Senate floor. That was a very proud moment. But again, I was proud when it was signed into law too on July 26th. Then there's another little story about that. I don't talk about it much, but since this is for archives or something, I'll talk about it. Usually when the president signs a bill, it has been standard practice before and since that the president always has the major sponsors of the bill with him when he signs the bill. Well, obviously I was the major sponsor on the Senate side. But I was up for re-election in 1990. And I'd been hit pretty hard by a lot of the Chamber of Commerce and the business people, and my opponent who was running against me was making an issue of this ADA thing too. So anyway, but I had a very tough race that year. And so when Bush signed it into law, he fixed it so that no one in the legislative branch would be on the stage, because if they had to have one, they'd have to have me up there. And so none of the sponsors of the bills were on the platform with him when he signed the bill. Interestingly enough.
Somebody described that as an incredibly petty moment.
It was kind of petty. But you know, I tell you what made it whole for me was the fact that Justin Dart was there. As long as Justin Dart was there, I could forgive anything, because he really was the father of this whole thing, the head of the movement. He was always out there. And I might have objected to somebody else on the platform, but as long as Justin Dart was there, it made it all right as far as I was concerned.
Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. Producer, Phyllis Ward, Access Video. Interviewers, Phyllis Ward and Mary Lou Breslin. Post-production, editing, captions, audio description, Dave Newholt. Stewardship, promotion, distribution, Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. Mary Lou Breslin, Susan Henderson. Special thanks goes to both the sung and the unsung heroes who worked tirelessly to make the Americans with Disabilities Act a reality. The Disability Rights Leadership Series owes a debt of gratitude to the individuals who agreed to be interviewed and without whose passion and dedication the ADA would not have become law. The series would not have come about without the vision of Pat Wright, longtime Director of Governmental Affairs for DREDF, and Arlene Mayerson, DREDF's directing attorney, who conceptualized the series and the interview themes. Thanks goes to the University of San Francisco for sponsoring the project that included the Disability Rights Leadership Series, and the Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley, for accepting an archival copy of the unedited interviews and providing a safe and permanent home for the collection. The series would not have been possible without funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. A list of the interviewees and links to their interviews can be found at dredf.org. 2015.